Thank you very much, Peter. Chief of Army, distinguished colleagues and friends. I've been asked to speak to you today about lessons drawn from the deployment of the Australian Army to East Timor between the 20th September 1999 and the 23rd of February 2000 as part of Operations Warden and Stabilise. That is, the Army's role within and in support of the International Force East Timor, or INTERFET. Well, I was very pleased to take up this invitation, especially as Pete mentioned, INTERFET's been a centre point of my scholarly life for some time now and the subject of my own volume within the ongoing official history project concerning Iraq, Afghanistan and East Timor. I should note, while the official history project is conducted within a classified environment, it's important to note that the contents of this paper, while inevitably informed along the way by things that I've seen, is unclassified. Before I begin, please also allow me to make some specific comment about the tone and the tenor of this paper. At its peak, the INTERFET coalition was made up from contributions from some 23 separate countries and numbered close to 11,000 military personnel, all under the command of an Australian commander, the then Major General Peter Cosgrove, and what equated, more or less, to an Australian headquarters. The Australian Defence Force provided more than 5,500 troops to this coalition, more than 5,000 of which came from the Army, around 270 from the Navy and close to 420 odd from the Royal Australian Air Force. This was the single largest deployment of ADF personnel since World War II, slightly larger than Vietnam at its peak in 1967-8, and one not plugged into any other nation's logistic and administrative support structure. It was also the first time Australia had led such a large multinational force, and all from a standing start. In short, the East Timor crisis was perhaps the most complex strategic challenge this nation had faced, at least since the 1940s. Nor can there be any doubt that INTERFET was remarkably successful, indeed one of the most successful UN enterprise of its type ever seen by any sensible measure. The United Nations Security Council, in its Resolution 1264 of the 15th of September 1999, had given INTERFET three clear missions: to restore peace and security to the troubled province, to protect and support the ongoing UNIMET UN mission in carrying out its task, and, within force capabilities, to facilitate humanitarian assistance operations. All of this INTERFET accomplished at the lowest possible cost in Australian lives, and all within 157 days. At the time that Resolution 1264 was released, policymakers and decision makers, not only in Canberra but in New York too, certainly did not anticipate success on this scale at such little cost within such a time frame. This was the stuff, ladies and gentlemen, of fanciful dreams, not the murky, frustrating business of third-party military interventions, be they of a peacemaking or a peacekeeping variety. Moreover, not only did INTERFET define the career of its commander, it also helped frame John Howard's Prime Ministership. All that followed in the new millennium was in many ways an aftershock compared to how he emerged as a national security leader in 1999. More to the point, the INTERFET mission represented an important step for the nation and its national security apparatus, a type of maturing in a regional context and as a middle power in Asia, a movement outside to some limited extent of the strategic wing of the United States. I would further personally argue it marked a watershed moment for the Australian Army. All of this was a triumph of INTERFET. There is no clearer testament to the skill and commitment than all involved than the outcome. This conference, though, is about lessons learned. Organisations, like people, tend to learn more from their mistakes than they do from their easy victories. I will therefore not dwell a one moment further on the success of INTERFET, but rather on its difficulties. I do not belittle the former, but must by needs focus this paper on the latter. It's further true that this entire conference might have been devoted to the lessons learned from the INTERFET deployment, from strategic logistics to individual training and so on and so forth. And it's impossible for me to be definitive in any sense in 40 short minutes. Nor do I think our time together is best spent with a once-over lightly approach. Instead, then, I'll aim my comments at one particular aspect of this deployment, that is, what is there to learn, or what was learned, in terms of expeditionary capabilities from the command, control and planning process that came at the eve of the INTERFET deployment. Well then, Let's cast our minds back some 18 years now, if you can believe it's that long. The ADF in the 1990s and the late 1990s was very much an organisation structured for peace, both in physical terms and in mental terms. When the Timor crisis struck, it found itself hollow and profoundly unsuited to large-scale overseas operations like that demanded by East Timor. The army in particular had atrophied since Vietnam. It's not just that it lacked experience in expeditionary operations of this scale, though that was certainly true, rather that, in line with the strategic guidance provided to it through the 1987 Defence of Australia doctrine, it had been actively structuring itself in a manner that would impede its ability to conduct such operations. In parallel, a long string of efficiencies or efficiency initiatives had been run in the context of an army, again, that was not to be seen to need a significant expeditionary capability. In response, the army shaved such capabilities to match available cash. The Defence Efficiency Review alone, one of around 13 efficiency programs, gutted numbers and capabilities tied with a potential need to fight abroad. It was little surprise, therefore, that in this context, defence planners, strategic thinkers up to 1999, had never seriously anticipated that a contingency of the scale of the East Timor crisis would arise with so little warning. Within the army, and many of you might recall, there was a belief verging on gospel that no unit outside of the RDF, or 3 Brigade, the Army's high readiness formation of the era, would ever deploy into a warlike situation. Even within 3 Brigade, thinking was aligned to the deployment of the online battalion at most, possibly with the attachment of a small TAC element of brigade headquarters, nothing more, nothing larger. Across the organisation, the idea of a large Australian force as the core of an international coalition under Australian leadership was beyond sensible consideration. The focus of ADF preparations and trainings therefore followed the view of this strategic landscape. The ADF had not practiced mounting an overseas operation on such a scale, and it focused mostly on what it would do once it was in a theatre. It therefore failed to develop or test enabling functions, nor had it really tested newer joint organisations and capabilities, and I'll return to that in a moment. The large-scale exercises that were mounted up to 99 did not properly rehearse, for example, the use of strategic-level warning orders, notices to move, joint command and control, or significant force sustainment under simulated operational conditions. The ADF had seriously not prepared, not trained and not exercised for deployment at INTERFET, naturally enough, because it was considered outside the scope of what the government might ask it to do. On the eve of the INTERFET deployment, however, the current CDF, Admiral Chris Barry, reassured the public that it had an ADF that had a comprehensive planning process already in place. In a similar vein, immediately after the deployment had begun, the Minister for Defence, John Moore, assured the world that prudent preparations had been going on throughout 1999. Both statements were, of course, true from a certain point of view. By the evening of the 9th September 1999, as the INTERFET naval flotilla made its way to Dili under the cover of darkness, and as the troops from the Special Forces component and from 3 Brigade finalised their kit checks before they crammed aboard those C-130s, a planning process had certainly been completed. The road to this end, however, was never as smooth or routine as these statements and a range of other contemporary press releases and media reporting seemed to imply. On the contrary, the experience of planning for INTERFET was deeply problematic, and the product, the plan, bore all the scars of an organisation conditioned for peace at best and limited operations at home at worst. There is no question that the tireless work and professional commitment of a multitude of individuals from the CDF downwards pushed the plan to the point where it could be mounted, yet such men and women struggled against structures and processes and cultures which presented as significant barriers every step of the way. To me, their achievements all the more remarkable for this fact. Well, planning problems began at the top. Strategic guidance was lacking. There was no new military strategic estimate, for example, produced after March 1999 at more than a draft stage, despite the looming crisis in Timor. In terms of whole-of-government approaches, there was a clear feeling and some angst at the strategic level within Defence that interdepartmental activities up to at least August 1999 had been dominated by departments like DFAT and PM&C. These two agencies, naturally enough, pushed their own agendas, primarily the importance of maintaining the relationship with Indonesia, with little apparent knowledge or care of their implications on the ADF. Indeed, there seemed a belief in Barton that readying forces for deployment, you might think an obvious requirement for a significant military undertaking, might negatively impact attempts to resolve the crisis peacefully and in effect become a type of self-fulfilling prophecy. As a result of such tensions, some of the observers describe an atmosphere where the best thing Defence could be seen to be doing at high-level interagency activities was to sit at the back of the room and keep quiet. Other senior Defence representatives worried Defence's own representation at interagency activities was perhaps not forceful enough in the face of dominant DFAT and PM&C positions and personalities. Prime Minister and Cabinet often assumed a de facto lead within this interdepartmental planning process, but a clear division of responsibilities between government departments was at no stage achieved. This reflected, perhaps, that the long peace had also left its impact on the national security apparatus and left it profoundly unpractised. It had to be slowly led through Defence, and Admiral Barry does deserve due credit in this regard, through a range of key decision-making moments throughout the crisis. There are also significant frictions at the highest levels within Defence itself. Fracture lines became apparent, for example, between senior uniforms and senior public servants. Bizarrely in hindsight, but very much in keeping of the tenor of the time, the earliest planning focus at the strategic level seemed to be on how to get out of Timor and transition to a blue hat UN operation as fast as possible, rather than what might have needed to be done to complete the mission at hand. Meanwhile, Defence cobbled together ad hoc structures to deal with the complexity of mounting such an operation in such a politically charged environment and outside Australia, which were reflective perhaps more of a lack of a standing capability to deal with this type of crisis than any nimbleness of management practice. Significant gaps in strategic thinking emerged. Beyond a desire to deploy a media support unit, for example, no Defence public affairs plan was ever drafted to INTERFET prior to its dispatch, nor was any domestic nor international public information strategy covering the military operation considered at a strategic level. Until, that is, Indonesian information operations and their impact led to a scrambled response in October, weeks after the operation had launched. More significantly still, concrete problems connected to high-level ADF command and control arrangements soon emerged. Perhaps most pointedly, the complex and problematic relationships that had grown during the ADF evacuation operations from East Timor immediately prior to INTERFET, Operation Spitfire, were inherited by its successor. In the case of Spitfire, Major General Cosgrove, as commander of the Deployable Joint Force Headquarters, or DJFHQ, had been placed in command of Joint Task Force 645, an umbrella organisation for any and all ADF evacuation operations from the province. Yet for the concurrent Spitfire Special Recovery Operation, one of the two separate roles for the Spitfire Special Forces component, known as JTF 504, the commanding officer of the SAS was designated Evacuation Commander, not Cosgrove, and he reported to Headquarters Special Operations for this contingency, not DJFHQ. In practical terms, Cosgrove and his headquarters did not so much command JTF 504, they never did, they monitored its activities. On top of such arrangements, due to the political nature of any operation mounted, the CDF sought an open line of communication and control, if necessary, through Major General Mike Keating's Strategic Command Division in Canberra. Well, as Spitfire wound up on the 18th of September, Admiral Barry appointed General Cosgrove as Commander INTERFET. At this point again, problems associated with what happens when peacetime structures meet the strategic reality of a large and complicated deployment again began to be exposed. INTERFET was a big deal at the time. It was a centre of attention from the Prime Minister downwards, reflecting this importance and continuing the arrangements put in place during Spitfire. Cosgrove was placed under Barry's direct command. He was to report through the CDF to the Australian Government and to the United Nations. In practice, This meant that General Cosgrove spoke daily with General Keating, now originally raised by Barry in his time as Vice Chief of the Defence Force to act as a connecting mechanism between defence and government by translating operational capabilities into policy options. Strategic Command Division managed to transform itself over the course of INTERFET into a pseudo-operational headquarters, with Keating drafting Barry's paperwork for Cosgrove and Cosgrove ringing his old friend to seek counsel as to how he ought to reply. It was, of course, entirely within the CDF's remit to make whatever command arrangements he saw fit, and Admiral Barry had very good reasons for making the choices that he did. Nonetheless, this was not how the ADF had structured itself for such an operation. Rather, based largely on the experiences of running large-scale tri-service exercises in the early 1990s, the then CDF, General John Baker, had raised Headquarters Australian Theatre and appointed a full-time theatre commander in Sydney to create a separate, operational level headquarters to plan, command and conduct joint operations so that the tactical deployable headquarters, DGFHQ, could focus on tactical issues and to ensure that Defence Headquarters in Canberra at the strategic level did not get bogged down in the minutiae of day-to-day issues. The deliberate bypassing of Headquarters Australian Theatre in favour of a Keating-Cosgrove-Barry axis left a tangled thicket of command relationships in its wake. Why then did Barry make what I think in hindsight was probably the right decision to put Cosgrove under his direct command? Well, as noted, it did reflect the political reality. INTERFET was enormously important to the government domestically and to Australia's position in the region and the world. Even comparatively minor tactical operations and incidents had the potential to have not only strategic but political outcomes or consequences. The Prime Minister and Cabinet demanded timely and direct answers from the CDF with the expectation that he knew directly about events on the ground, not filtered through other channels. Putting Cosgrove under his command helped ensure this would happen, and also, probably wisely, shielded INTERFET's commanders from a multitude of other players who might otherwise have wanted to exercise their influence. Put simply, the government, the CDF and the Head Strategic Command Division all wanted to closely monitor and influence operational events, and the arrangements put in place allowed them to do so. Yet while Barry's decision reflected all of these realities, it also clearly demonstrated a lack of confidence in the theatre model which happened to permeate the upper echelons of the ADF at the time. While the ADF had the basic idea how this model was supposed to function, the specifics were still being fleshed out in the late 1990s, and Headquarters Australian Theatre's limited operations to date, it was perceived to have hindered as much as it had enabled. Faced with urgent deadlines and an ongoing need to compartmentalise, and I'll return to that, senior officers focused on making things work, not respecting technical, untested command and control pathways. Personal relationships, service loyalties trumped doctrinal notions of theatre command. When the chips were down, form just didn't equal substance. The Commander Australian Theatre, or COMAST, in 1999, Air Vice Marshal Bob Treloar walked a very difficult line, to say the least. Confusion was a predictable result of high-level command and control arrangements where established pathways and established chains were to some extent circumvented or ignored. Authority and responsibility for decisions were sometimes not recognised, especially when staffs held differing expectations. There were significant duplications of effort caused by conflicting orders and conflicting advice. The whole issue was doubly problematic for the Navy and the Air Force, far more inclined to accept Headquarters Australian Theatre as a commanding headquarters than the Army ever was. Yet even within DGFHQ there were levels of confusion and early frustration as the marginalisation of theatre meant existing procedures and relationships were suddenly abandoned or needed to be reinterpreted on the run. Certainly what was confusing within the ADF was much more impenetrable to our external coalition partners. Well, a shining example of the consequences or form and consequences of such high-level command and control models in the latter planning stages of INTERFET involved a series of events at Headquarters 1 Brigade in Darwin. As the Operation Spitfire evacuations commenced, the officer commanding C Squadron 2nd Cavalry Regiment was called to meet with Commander 1 Brigade. who had been in contact with Maritime Headquarters and Headquarters Australian Theatre in Sydney, and the captain of HMAS Tobruk. Brigade Headquarters ordered the squadron to load its vehicles aboard Tobruk on the 8th of September, in order the ship meet its notice to move requirements. This task was completed early the next evening after a quick farewell ceremony conducted at 2 Cavalry Regiment lines, which involved families. The subsequent Sea Squadron vehicle embarkation was quite a public event, with national media outlets providing a comprehensive coverage in coordination and consultation with one brigade's own public relations personnel. After all, this was an important moment for the brigade. By Tobruk's direction, squadron personnel boarded the following day. Discussions ensued on the bridge between the captain of the vessel and the officer commanding the squadron concerning putting to sea that night or the next. The next day, though, the cavalry major took a call from Headquarters 3 Brigade. Pete did mention we timed this well. Took a call from Headquarters 3 Brigade demanding to know what was going on and who had authorised his squadron to load. Apparently, elements within ADHQ were ropeable over the overt loading of armoured vehicles at a particularly vulnerable point in diplomatic activity with Indonesia, and had vented their frustrations in clear terms upon Headquarters 3 Brigade, currently in command of the squadron. The media messaging of troops prepare for war was considered less than helpful at this point. Subsequent phone discussions from Townsville made it crystal clear to the OC that under no circumstances was he to sail without more orders from Townsville. Sea Squadron personnel duly disembarked. Over the next few days, the captain of Tobruk, with what appeared to be unambiguous direction from his own naval chain of command, contacted the squadron a number of times, ordering them aboard his ship as it intended to sail. The OC, however, refused, or declined, let me say, in accordance with instructions he'd received from 3 Brigade. Eventually the squadron did re-embark on the 16th of September, less again its commander, who still refused to board for fear of the ship sailing during the night whilst he was asleep. At last, with permission from 3 Brigade, he did board the next day. The debacle of Sea Squadron's on-again, off-again antics with Tobruk were remarkable on a number of levels. The squadron assumed as part of ongoing high-level planning and deployment preparations that 1 Brigade Headquarters was in the know. This was not the case. Rather, the brigade commander was responding to naval requests which had come directly from the CDF's office, unbeknownst to him, apparently as a deception operation aimed at the Australian media. Well, the effort was successful, deception was achieved, and not just of the media. Headquarters 1 Brigade, for its part, might reasonably have assumed that the order to place Sea Squadron aboard Tobruk had been synchronised with all elements of Defence Headquarters, DGFHQ and 3 Brigade. This too was clearly not the case. Sea Squadron's actions appeared to some as contrary to a higher intent, yet it was an intent that was not being promulgated. All actors were doing what they thought needed to be done, but all were acting without necessary information to guide them. If nothing else, the whole affair underscored a considerable inconsistency and inefficiency to do with the passage of communication across various chains of command. But to leave command and control aside for one point, difficulties too emerged with the ADF's tri-service integration on the eve of INTERFET. In truth, the large kangaroo exercises of the 80s and 1990s had failed to bring the 3 service under effective joint command or to establish efficient joint movements or joint logistic arrangements, and little had been done since to set it straight in anything other than a mostly administrative environment. Under pressure, the organisation reverted to what it knew and what it was comfortable with, back to its default settings. These did not always equate with joinery. Rather, without deep cultural buy-in, the veneer of tri-services was maintained until such time as it mattered. A useful case study then of the lack of a real or deep tri-serviceness, if that's a word, within the ADF was Major General Cosgrove's own headquarters. In many ways, DJFHQ in the late 90s was still a model concept, with theories about how it might come together in a serious crisis, but had not practiced beforehand in more than restricted ways. Comprehensive, robust joint planning, joint doctrine, joint procedures was lacking, as, critically, was a joint perspective. In August and September 1999, DJFHQ remained essentially an army headquarters, labelled joint and fitted for, but not with, I believe that's the right terminology, the other two services. It was absolutely land-centric. Its maritime and air components were not permanently manned other than single liaison officers. When air and sea component staffs did eventually arrive to supplement the headquarters during the INTERFET planning process, it proved difficult to even give them office space, communications or computers. Nor had Cosgrove previously worked with either his RAF or his RAN component commanders. When those components arrived at DJFHQ, they quickly realised that the headquarters planning staff had hitherto been meeting essentially without air and sea advice. Indeed, the naval component commander, when he arrived, was forced to knock on a door and asked to be included in headquarters briefings. Unsurprisingly, in this context, initial directives from DJFHQ were possessed of a land-centric flavour which did not always seem to consider or understand maritime issues. From an Air Force perspective, a similar atmosphere of unfamiliarity pervaded, where the air component cell and the wider headquarters were unknown quantities to each other, and where the nuances of a whole new environment needed to be learnt under pressure and on the run. In terms of relationships, certainly at the top, DJFHQ was welcoming, but this was not always felt at a working level. Army planners, it seemed, were distinctly unaccustomed and uncomfortable with the other two services questioning what they might be doing and why they might be doing it. The root of such problems, though, ought not be laid solely at Army's doorstep. After all, difficulties of tri-service integration were well known at Headquarters Australian Theatre, and little effective action had been taken prior to this point to address them. So too, a range of Air Force and Navy difficulties in this regard were self-inflicted. The Air Force had chosen, for a variety of reasons, not to fill its billets at DJFHQ on a standing basis, while the naval component of the headquarters was established in January 1999, but was placed at maritime headquarters in Sydney, not with the rest of the headquarters in Brisbane. In addition, a number of incumbents were dual-hatted, including the key RAN appointment of Commodore Flotillas, who was to be the naval component commander for any joint deployment, once again perhaps underscoring a relatively low naval prioritisation of DJFHQ. Well, this clash of cultures was well demonstrated at a famous, or we might say infamous, briefing in the DJFHQ Theaterette, which I'm sure many of you know, on the 14th September, only 6 days before the launch of this deployment. Their senior staff in Brisbane briefed a set of rather senior visitors, including not only COMAST, but the ADF's 3 environmental commanders, the land, maritime and air commanders, head of special operations and senior logisticians as to the plan as it then existed 6 days out. The revelation that initial lodgements would require 7 HMAS Tobruk equivalents and around 350 C-130 sorties caused an uproar amongst the invited guests. Navy and Air Force guests saw it as typical of Army attitudes, while senior Army guests complained that had the other two services put more effort into the headquarters, perhaps the problem might not have arisen. But for planners at DJFHQ, these complaints missed the point entirely. These planners were well aware that this plan couldn't be supported by Australian strategic lift assets, but hitherto, all attempts to get Australian theatre or the single services to close the gap through coalition or commercial assets had fallen on deaf ears. This briefing served then as the shock necessary to get the system moving and to induce cooperation. Nothing brings on cooperation like a crisis, even if this occurred once more outside of established channels. My third point I'll cover, beyond issues of command and control, as I've said, and tri-serviceness, a third significant driver of planning difficulties during the planning phase of INTERFET was a severe and continuing veil of secrecy drawn across anything and everything to do with East Timor until the last possible moment. Once more, the issue of the relationship with Indonesia was to a large part the basis and justification for such secrecy, and again, the diplomats continued to make the running in this regard. Well, certainly, a level of operational compartmentalisation was standard ADF practice, yet the degree of secrecy in this case and how late it was enforced was not. Sensitivity over the bilateral relationship with Jakarta and Indonesian perceptions of any overt ADF preparations and how they might impact upon it were overwhelming issues. Even simple anticipatory actions, like the predisposition of stores, were constrained by diplomatic and international relations considerations. The result was that a situation where the authorities for force preparation, readiness and deployment to mounting bases was removed from the appropriate commanders. Instead, each was forced to seek endless approvals for any and all changes at the strategic level. This process was itself time-consuming, added little of value, and significantly increased workload at multiple headquarters. For a number of senior ADF figures of the era, it was not so much the early confidentiality and clandestine nature of planning that was problematic. Such officers were well aware of the importance of political calculations. Rather, the fact that information was restricted for so long, up to the moment of the landings themselves. This policy inhibited effective planning, excluded essential staff at critical times, and subsequently resulted in readiness, training and force preparation difficulties, you guessed it, at the tactical level. Across the board, the personnel responsible for force preparation and the identification of support requirements were not provided with the adequate information with which to conduct their duties effectively. The trickle of information that did flow downwards to the tactical level was just enough to give people an impression, but was an impression not based on a thorough understanding of what the mission was going to be, the challenges that might confront it, or even what capabilities would be needed to execute it. As it became apparent that this operation was getting bigger and bigger, planners at DGFHQ and at 3 Brigade needed to bring in subordinate units, but for some considerable time, this was forbidden. There was, of course, as many of you will no doubt realise, a real military price to be paid for the strictness and length of compartmentalisation of INTERFET preparations. The first casualty was the planning process itself. Ideally, the process would have begun at the top and would have worked its way down. Upon receiving comprehensive strategic guidance from the government, ADHQ would have provided sufficient information to theatre for the production of a theatre-level concept of operations. This would have been passed to DGFHQ as the deploying headquarters, and component commanders would be assigned, along with force elements as the plan matured. Detailed operational planning would then commence through those components, coordinated once again by DGFHQ. Specialist advice would have been drawn from across the ADF as required. All the while, developing plans would be back-briefed up the chain to ensure the final product was both militarily practical and in alignment with government intent. This didn't happen. Rather, crisis and pseudo-panic planning took the place of broader or more circumspect or more deliberate preparations. Information constraints caused a reverse sequence where the tactical and operational levels were forced to plan, they had no time not to, with limited guidance. All headquarters at this level to some extent felt insufficient guidance was given in a timely manner, and each blundered on, exposed in the semi-darkness as best they could. Even at DGFHQ, the fulcrum of planning, once the process had begun, there were complaints of a lack of clear directions and clear parameters within which to work. The INTERFET plan then, as a result, was one essentially designed and written in haste, in fact written overnight, at Headquarters 3 Brigade, the land component headquarters. By necessity, this land plan was itself shaped by the requirements of Spitfire, an entirely different operation. The problematic nature of this reverse sequence, especially as it pertained to logisticians, was not lost on those doing the planning. Certainly a large number of frantic phone calls occurred in an all-consuming sort of blur of activity, but formal planning frameworks were consistently lacking. Further, additions and amendments to the 3 Brigade plan as it made its way back up the ADF chain to the National Security Committee, as it did, were undertaken as a sort of disjointed incrementalism, a process of juggling who was going to do what in terms of people and organisations, which unfolded on the run. The process itself consumed considerable time and effort and was a marked distraction. Moreover, the very strict number of people that could be read into preparation for the deployment acted against one of the primary strengths of the doctrinal military appreciation process, which relied on the combination and integration of a broad range of subject matter experts to provide their input. Much specialist advice was subsequently not available to planning cells in Townsville and Brisbane, and when individuals were cleared to join, they were often frustrated to see that their early advice might have improved the plan or saved time by overcoming the difficulties already encountered. The problem then was not in actually reaching or making decisions, but as had been observed during Operation Hardihood, the deployment of the Australian Task Force to Vietnam, in obtaining the appropriate amount of information to make the best decisions. Under such circumstances, there was no surprise that the planning focus prior to the deployment was always on getting there. There was simply not much spare planning effort left over for considerations of actual tasks once we were in East Timor, especially those not directly related to security. INTERFET's mandated included responsibilities for humanitarian relief, for example, as I've mentioned, but these received no more than lip service in the rush to formulate a plan to arrive and arrive safely. The whole process was far from the depth of planning desirable for such an important contingency. In many cases, the most dramatic problems associated with compartmentalisation manifested at a unit and a sub-unit level. Strict secrecy meant no ability to plan vertically. Units were unable to be prepared beforehand and they crashed through their notice to move thresholds. Theatre took advice from the environmental commanders as to what was reasonable risk in this regard, considerations that didn't mean much at the coalface, particularly for logistics units. By the final planning stages, East Timor and Australia's likely military role were media issues, yet continuing secrecy, officially at least, robbed deploying units of preparation time. After the fact, INTERFET COs were of one voice in this regard. Short lead times for training and equipping and personal administration left the force with serious capability deficiencies. Most units deployed with levels of manning and equipment well short of minimum levels of capability, let alone operational levels of capability. One of 3 brigades, 2 battalions, 3 RAR, rued the fact that its deployment was well beyond its capability preparedness director's requirements, and urged in future for low readiness units to be manned to sufficient levels in stores and people and equipment to allow for immediate and non-augmented deployment. Well, one and all, what can all I've said contribute to the Army's skill of adaptability then, or learning curve in contact? Well, let me say this. In Timor, the Army relied entirely too much on skilled, dedicated and adaptable people who made things work in spite of the systems in place, not because of them. The curve was too steep. Much of this was a dividend of an organisation structured for peace and a conception of its possible employment, I concede again, in line with the strategic guidance provided to it, that failed to take into account the reality of what it actually might be asked to do. No one in a green uniform in the 1990s seriously contemplated the deployment overseas of a divisional-sized force under Australian leadership. Unsurprisingly, the very essence of any successful operations, effective command and control and planning apparatuses, were found wanting. INTERFET worked, though, in spite of such weaknesses, not because of strength in this regard. It worked because no one pushed back. This is unlikely to be consistently the case in all future expeditionary operations. In 1999, the Army was confident in what it thought it could do, not what it might be called on to do, and there's a difference. The consequences of failing in East Timor in 1999 would have been far-reaching. The consequences I put to you of failing next time the ADF is called to launch and perhaps lead a large expeditionary military operation in the region in the absence of a great power structure within which to comfortably nestle might be catastrophic. Thank you.